I am standing in my mother's kitchen while my father tells the entire family that marrying a janitor is the same as throwing my life in the trash. A minute earlier, I had still been holding a paper plate and trying not to shake. My father, Walter Bennett, looked at me as if I had embarrassed him in front of people who mattered more than I did. My mother kept folding napkins beside the sink with her eyes lowered, and my sister Paige stared at her drink like this had nothing to do with her. The betrayal was painfully simple. They told everyone I had chosen a man beneath me and, by doing that, had chosen to walk away from them. I left that house with one suitcase, a few $100s, and the family name they suddenly wanted me to carry only in shame. I never needed their approval to become who I was meant to be. My name is Claire Bennett, or at least it was then. I was 26 when I married Nolan Reed at the county courthouse on a gray Friday afternoon. He worked nights as a janitor at Lincoln Middle School and picked up weekend maintenance jobs anywhere he could. My father owned a building supply company in our town and had spent years telling people that hard work mattered more than status. But what he meant was that hard work only mattered when it came wrapped in the kind of title he could brag about. Nolan had kind hands. That was what I noticed before anything else. He fixed things carefully, listened fully, and never made a show of being decent. To my family, those things counted for nothing. What they saw was his worn pickup, his second-hand work boots, and the fact that his paycheck barely covered rent in the small apartment he had before we got married. That night in my mother's kitchen, my Aunt Gloria tried to smooth it over by saying love had a way of surprising people. My father answered her without taking his eyes off me. He said, "Love doesn't pay bills, and it doesn't erase bad choices." Paige gave one small shrug, the same shrug she had used my entire life whenever something unfair happened to me, and she didn't want to lose her place by noticing it. Some families make room for your happiness. Mine treated it like a public offense. If this story touched you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it today. My mother finally spoke when I reached for my purse. She did not ask me to stay. She only said, very quietly, "Your father is upset. Don't make this worse." I remember looking at her hands. She was twisting a dish towel so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. Even then, even with my heart pounding hard enough to make my throat ache, I understood something I had spent years avoiding. Cruelty does not always look loud. Sometimes, it looks like a person deciding not to interrupt it. Nolan was waiting in the driveway under the weak porch light. He had wanted to come in with me, but I asked him not to. I told myself I could handle one family dinner. I told myself if they heard me out, if they met me where I was standing, they might still choose me. Instead, I climbed into his truck with my eyes burning and did not look back at the house until we reached the corner. That was the last night I entered it as their daughter. A week later, my father mailed me my childhood photo albums in a torn cardboard box with no note inside. My college diploma was folded in half. The silver bracelet my grandmother had given me for graduation was missing. I sat on the floor of our apartment and stared at those albums for a long time before I put them back in the box and slid it into the closet. Nolan never asked me what my father had said. He only brought me a chipped mug of tea and sat beside me in silence until I could breathe again. I learned that being disowned can sound less like a slammed door and more like a room going politely quiet. That fall, Nolan and I left Ashford and moved to Columbus because there was nothing left for us in a town that had heard my father's version before I had a chance to speak my own. We rented a thin-walled apartment over an old tailor shop on a noisy street where buses rattled the windows before sunrise. The radiator knocked all winter. The sink leaked under the cabinet. When it rained, the hallway smelled faintly of damp plaster and bleach. I found part-time work at a dental office, answering phones. Nolan kept cleaning schools at night and picked up small repair jobs during the day when he could. We passed each other in doorways like tired people on opposite shifts in the same long storm. Some evenings, dinner was canned tomato soup and toast cut into uneven strips because bread felt easier to swallow when money was tight. That night, I nearly told Nolan I wanted to go back and apologize for everything, even though I had done nothing wrong. The sentence rose all the way to my mouth and then stopped there. He was asleep in the chair by the window, his work shirt still dusted with drywall powder, one hand hanging loose at his side. I looked at him and realized what apology would really mean. It would mean asking permission to love the person I had already chosen. So I stayed where I was. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The dental office cut my hours after Christmas. Nolan slipped on an icy school walkway in January and worked for 2 weeks with his wrist wrapped in an elastic band because we could not afford for him to rest. I remember counting coins on the kitchen table for laundry while snow pressed itself against the corners of the window. I remember pretending I wasn't hungry so he would eat the last bowl of soup. I remember listening to the couple next door argue through the wall and wondering whether all rebuilding sounded like this at first. Thin, cold, and close to breaking. There is a particular loneliness that comes from being hungry in a city where no one knows your name. By spring, Nolan had started fixing things for a landlord who owned 3 small office buildings. A broken lock led to a plumbing job. A plumbing job led to a hallway repaint. The landlord paid late, but he paid. I began keeping invoices in a yellow notebook and taught myself bookkeeping from library books and free online classes at the public computer station. At night, while Nolan slept before his shift, I sat at our table with receipts, coffee gone cold, and the stubborn feeling that numbers might become a rope if I held on to them long enough. A few weeks later, something unexpected arrived in the mail. It was not from my family. It was a business license packet I had half forgotten I applied for after Nolan joked that my notebook made us look more official than some real companies. I held that envelope in both hands and laughed in a way that almost turned into crying. We did not have employees. We did not even have matching tools. What we had was a folded card table, 1 reliable ladder, 2 buckets, and a man who knew how to make old buildings work again. So we gave our work a name anyway. Reed Facility Services began in a rented storage unit and the back of Nolan's pickup. I answered calls, typed estimates, and dropped flyers under office park doors while he cleaned, repaired, painted, and hauled anything that needed hauling. Most weeks brought 2 rejections for every yes. Some people heard Nolan's old title and spoke to us as if we were lucky to be standing in their lobby. Some only wanted the cheapest bid possible. Once, a property manager looked at my shoes, looked at Nolan's hands, and asked if we were really insured in the tone people use when they already think they know the answer. We were, barely. Months passed. I took on weekend receptionist shifts to keep us afloat while building the books at night. Nolan stopped janitor work 1 contract at a time, replacing fixed wages with unstable ones, because we both knew the only way forward was through the risk we were already terrified of. There were mornings I woke before dawn with my jaw aching from grinding my teeth. There were afternoons I sat in my car after a failed pitch and let myself cry for exactly 3 minutes before wiping my face and going in somewhere else. Doubt has a quieter voice than fear, but it lingers longer. One afternoon, a pediatric clinic manager called about a cleaning quote I had nearly convinced myself would go nowhere. Her previous service had stopped showing up on time, and she needed someone dependable. Nolan walked the building with her that evening. I stayed up half the night refining the proposal and checking every line item twice. When she signed the contract the next morning, I stared at her name on the page until the letters blurred. Our first steady client was a pediatric clinic with a faded mural of whales across the waiting room wall. What I learned the following week changed everything. Steady work changed how we stood inside our own lives. We were still careful, still counting every expense, still one bad month away from panic, but the panic no longer owned every room. We paid off an overdue medical bill. We replaced the worst chair in our apartment with a secondhand desk. I bought a plain blue file cabinet from an office resale store, and for reasons I could not explain then, sliding our contracts into those drawers felt holier than anything I had done in a church. By the third year, we had 2 employees. By the 5th, Nolan no longer climbed every ladder himself. By the 7th, we moved into a small brick office on the edge of a light industrial block, where trains passed in the distance and a sycamore tree dropped leaves against the front steps each fall. I stopped introducing Nolan as someone who used to be a janitor. He was a facilities contractor, a business owner, and the steadiest person I had ever known. The title they had mocked had become the foundation under everything we built. Love looked poor to people who only understood appearances. 9 years passed that way. Slow, imperfect, earned. We never became rich. We became stable. There is a difference. Stability meant payroll made on time. It meant a savings account that no longer frightened me when I opened it. It meant I could buy groceries without doing math in the parking lot. It meant going home on some evenings before dark and finding Nolan in the kitchen making pasta with his sleeves rolled up, our dog asleep under the table, the window above the sink fogged from steam. I thought the wound had scarred over. I thought distance and work and time had done what they were supposed to do. Then, one cool October morning, my receptionist buzzed my office and said, "Claire, there's a woman here asking for you. She says she's your mother." For a second, I did not understand the sentence. Judith Bennett had not visited me in 9 years. She had not called on birthdays. She had not asked where we moved when the tailor shop apartment became too small. She had not sent a card when Nolan and I finally bought our modest 2-bedroom house on the west side. Silence had been her chosen language. I had learned to live without translation. When I stepped into the lobby, she was standing beside the front window in a wool coat the color of wet sand, holding a cream envelope against her chest. She looked older, smaller through the shoulders, but her mouth was set in the same line I remembered from the kitchen sink all those years ago. She did not hug me. She said, "You look well." I said, "Why are you here?" She looked around at the desks, the framed certificates on the wall, the staff moving through the hallway with clipboards and keys. I watched her take in the office the way people do when they are adjusting to a version of you they were sure could never exist. Then she held out the envelope. "We need your help," she said. The people who had thrown me away were standing at my desk asking to be carried. I did not take the envelope right away. I asked who "we" meant, though I already knew. She lowered herself into the chair across from my office and said my father's business had been struggling for years. Big chains had undercut prices. Paige's husband had invested in a side venture that failed. There had been loans. There had been temporary measures. Now the bank was threatening action, and the house could be lost unless the family secured one more extension. She said Nolan's company had a strong balance sheet. She said our names could help. Then, after a pause heavy enough to bruise, she said the part she had likely rehearsed on the drive over. "After everything your father did for you growing up, this is a moment to do the right thing." I took the envelope from her hand and set it on my desk without opening it. It is a strange thing to hear the word family used as leverage by people who once withdrew it as punishment. My mother kept talking. She said my father was proud, too proud to come himself. She said Paige was under pressure. She said a signature from me and a meeting with Nolan might be enough to steady things. She said it all in the careful voice of someone trying to make a demand sound like a bridge. I asked her one question. When I married Nolan, did you think I would come back one day and save all of you? Her eyes moved to the envelope. Claire, that isn't fair. Fair. The word sat between us like a shard of glass. I told her I would review the papers. I told her nothing else. She stood, adjusted her coat, and for 1 second I thought she might finally say something true. Something about the kitchen, the box of albums, the birthdays, the years. Instead, she only said, "Please don't take too long." After she left, I locked my office door before opening the envelope. Inside were loan documents, tax notices, 2 past-due vendor statements, and a typed page listing assets the family had offered as collateral. My eyes stopped on my own name before my mind caught up to it. A personal guarantee bearing my signature was attached to an older business line I had never seen in my life. It had been dated almost 3 years after I left Ashford. I read it twice, then a third time. My hands went cold. By the time I arrived home that evening, the rain had already started. Nolan found me still sitting in the car with the cream envelope on my lap. I carried it inside and spread the papers across our kitchen table while the dog nosed my knee and the kettle clicked softly in the background. Nolan read in silence, jaw tightening only when he reached the signature page. "That's not yours," he said. "No," I answered, "but somebody wanted it to be." He looked at me across the table, not angry, not shocked, just steady in the way that had saved me more than once. "What do you want to do?" I wasn't there to fight. I wasn't there to argue. I was there for one reason only. "The truth," I said. The next morning, I called an attorney named Dana Mercer, whose office handled business fraud and contract disputes. She had been recommended by a client years earlier, and I remembered liking how plainly she spoke. I emailed her scans of everything in the envelope. By noon, she called me back and asked me to come in. Her office sat above a bakery on a quiet downtown street. The smell of cinnamon followed me up the stairs. Dana wore a charcoal blazer, spoke in measured sentences, and tapped the guarantee page with one short fingernail. "This signature was likely copied from an older file," she said, "and if your bank records show no involvement, whoever submitted this document exposed themselves." I sat very still. She turned another page and pointed to a notary stamp. The date was wrong. The county was wrong. The document trail was sloppy in the way desperate people get sloppy when they think family silence will cover them. Then she said something that made the room narrow around me. "There's more than one issue here. Whoever brought you these papers may not realize the bank already flagged the discrepancy. They need you to sign now because they're trying to paper over what came before." A few beats passed before I could answer. My mother knew? Dana did not soften her voice. Whether she knew or not, she carried the envelope. The truth does not always arrive when you want it. It arrives when it's ready. Not long after, Dana obtained copies of supplemental filings the bank had attached to the old line of credit. My father, Walter Bennett, had used my name on 2 guarantees connected to rescue loans for Paige's husband's failed event rental company. One had helped refinance the family home. The other had covered overdue supplier payments at my father's business. He had not only disowned me, he had reached into the life I built after him and tried to use my absence as shelter. There are wounds that do not come from strangers. They come from the people who keep a place set at the table and still make sure you understand it was never really yours. Dana asked whether I wanted to pursue criminal action immediately. I told her I wanted one meeting first. One room. One chance to hear them say out loud what they had done. She studied me for a moment, then nodded the way practical people do when they recognize that law and healing are not always the same road. She arranged it for Saturday morning at my parents' house. Rain had cleared by then, leaving the porch damp and the maple leaves dark against the sidewalk. I had not stood in front of that house in 9 years. The paint looked more tired. The porch railing leaned slightly to one side. For a moment, I saw myself at 26, climbing down these steps with one suitcase and a face I was trying hard not to let collapse. Nolan came with me but stayed near the car until I called him in. Dana carried a leather briefcase. I carried the cream envelope. Inside, my mother had set out coffee none of us touched. Paige sat rigid at the dining room table with her husband beside her, both of them dressed like people hoping neat clothes might make a mess look smaller. My father remained standing by the window in a sweater vest, as if this were still his room to control. He looked at Nolan first, then he looked at me and said,
"This didn't need to become such a production."
I almost smiled at that. Men like my father call truth a production when it no longer belongs to them. Dana opened her briefcase, laid out copies of the guarantees, the bank correspondence, the notarization record, and a signature comparison pulled from an old scholarship application I had filled out at 19. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. My mother went pale before she finished the first page. Paige said, "Dad told us Claire was already listed. He said it was a family umbrella." Dana turned to her. "Your father said many things. The paperwork says something else." My father tried to interrupt, but numbers are difficult things to bully. Dates lined up. Filing histories lined up. The notary stamp did not. The copied signature did not. The bank's warning letters addressed to him made it impossible for him to pretend this had all been some harmless misunderstanding. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my mother whispered, "Walter, tell me this isn't true." He did not answer her. He answered me.
"You left,"
he said.
"You walked out. Everything after that was damage control."
It was the closest he had ever come to admitting what he believed I was. An asset first, a daughter second, and only when convenient. I looked at him across the same room where I had once stood silent and ashamed. The curtains moved slightly in the draft from the old window frame. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. "You disowned me for marrying a man you thought had nothing," I said. "And then you spent years trying to borrow his future through my name." Nobody at the table moved. My mother covered her mouth with one hand. Paige stared down at the documents as if they might rearrange themselves if she looked long enough. Her husband leaned back in his chair, suddenly careful not to touch anything. My father straightened his shoulders and said,
"Families make hard choices."
"No," I replied. "You made selfish ones." That was all. I never needed their approval to become who I was meant to be. Dana explained the terms plainly. The fraudulent guarantees would be contested. The bank would receive formal notice by Monday. Any further contact about my signature would go through her office. If my parents or Paige attempted to pressure us again, the matter would escalate. She spoke the way a clean blade looks. Quiet, exact, impossible to argue with honestly. My mother began to cry then, but even that felt less like grief than the shock of realizing silence had finally run out. As Nolan and I stood to leave, my father said my name in a voice I had spent years waiting to hear soften. It did not soften. It only weakened.
"Claire."
I turned back because I wanted to know whether there was anything left in him beyond pride. There wasn't. He said,
"You'd really let this destroy the family?"
For the first time in that house, I felt no need to defend myself. "The family was already broken," I said. I just stopped pretending I was the crack. Then
I walked out.
The parking lot at the church across the street was empty and shining from the morning rain. Nolan opened the passenger door for me the way he always did when my hands were full, though that day all I carried was the cream envelope and the last of something I had been dragging for years. We drove home without music. When we reached our street, the clouds had thinned enough for a pale strip of light to fall across the porches and front steps. That evening, I took the old box of photo albums out of our closet. I looked through them slowly at the kitchen table while Nolan washed dishes beside me. There I was at 8, in a raincoat too big for my shoulders. There I was at 12, holding a library certificate no one remembered. There I was at 22, smiling in a dress my mother had once said made me look dependable, which I understood now was the closest thing to praise she knew how to give me. I kept 3 photos and put the rest back in the box. Some losses do not ask to be repaired. They ask to be named correctly. Later, after the house had gone quiet, I stepped onto our back porch with a mug of tea warming both hands. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and wood smoke from somewhere down the block. Inside, Nolan was locking the kitchen window and turning off the light over the sink. I did not feel victorious. I felt clear. I stood there a long time, listening to the last drops fall from the porch roof, until the dark street settled into stillness beyond the railing.